Thank you, Kathy. That was Kathy from Memorial Press. She's a colleague and friend. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for your interest in this topic. How many of you are in a school where you have a student who has some struggles or some special needs? It's pretty much unanimous, isn't it? So this is a topic that is dear to my heart for reasons that will become clear in this talk, but it's also something that's on the minds and hearts of our classical Christian schools across the nation. You received an index card. On that index card, please write the name of your school, the full name, not your nickname for the school, but the full name of your school. You did not receive a card. If you did not receive a card yet, then just raise your hand. We'll see if we have more. Michelle, I believe they are in my purse. And then your name, so your school's name, and your name, your email if you'd like to be contacted with some help, your school's name, your emails, and then your need. What's your pressing need in this context of classical education and special needs at this time? Your school's name, your email if you'd like to be contacted, and then a brief description of your need. Give you a few minutes to formulate that into a sentence. While we're waiting for index cards to be filled out, I do have some exciting news in the area of classical education and special needs. We now have resources that did not exist 10 or 20 years ago. The first is the book, Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child. Simply Classical. Raise your hand if you know of this book. And how many have read the book? This, for any headmasters who are here, this makes a wonderful introduction to the topic in the form of a book club that is an inexpensive in-service. Everyone can read a few chapters, then you all get together and you discuss those chapters within the context of your own situation. There's also a bulk discount for purchasing for faculty. Kathy could help you with that, or Jim over at Memorial Press. But Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child. It was intended to tell the story of how we can educate children with special needs with a classical education. But what it also became is a wonderful primer for what is classical education. When I first wanted to teach my own children, I had to decide, is it just rigorous? Is that all there is to a classical education? If so, then we might not be able to do that. But if it's more than rigor, perhaps it's beauty, perhaps it's formative, perhaps in a Christian context, it's eternal. Then these are things that I do want to give to my children. So the first part of Simply Classical kind of unpacks in a very accessible way what is classical education, and then what is Christian classical education, with Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of truth, goodness, and beauty for us and for each child. And you'll notice the cover is Jesus welcoming all children to himself. So the book, which is in its second edition, first came out in 2013, it's now 2019 was the second edition, so it has been updated. The other thing is a free resource. You can pick these up at the Memorial Press table. You can also subscribe to them at simplyclassical.com. It's a little magazine. It's also our catalog. So Martin Cawthron calls it a magalog. It's the Simply Classical Journal. We have articles and resources for teaching children with special needs classically. The Simply Classical Journal, simplyclassical.com. And last and most exciting is we just finished a 7-year project of creating an entire curriculum that can be taught in a parallel way to students with special needs within the classical Christian school. We start with age 2, so there's a wonderful early intervention program that someone could start with our A, B, and C. Those are our readiness levels. And you can take a look at those over at the booth during lunch. And then we start with student levels, level 1 and 2, and really 3, where the student's learning to read, but we break it down into a much more protracted process with more review, more multimodal instruction, and then we go all the way through levels 12, those just released. So really it's 15 levels, starting with our levels 5 and 6, we break them down into options of a 2-year or a 1-year accelerated. So actually, it takes a student from age 2 all the way to 21, which is precisely what I wish I would have had with my own children when I started teaching them. More on that in a moment. This first session, we have 4, by the way, graciously given to us by Scott and Kyle for this conference. 4 sessions on classical education and special needs. The first one really will be just for you, a listening and a pondering kind of a session. The next 3 will be very heavy on Q&A. I will be given an extra microphone that can be given to whomever, and we will just tackle the situations that you face. Michelle, could you collect the index cards? And I will begin while you're doing that. All right. Some parents and educators have the misconception that a classical education is only for smart kids. It's easy to understand why someone might think this way. Latin at age 8, Herodotus at age 14. With such standards, one might reason, surely classical education is only for born geniuses, the brightest and best of our children. And certainly for advanced performance at the highest levels of classical study, this theory has merit. But what about those children who are not born geniuses? What about those who, far from being intellectually gifted, are living with cognitive challenges, language disorders, or physical disabilities? Does classical education have anything to offer them? Can a classical education benefit any child? Helen Keller's concerned parents asked this same question back in 1887. Their young daughter was deaf, blind, and severely behaviorally disordered. Distraught and fearful for the little girl's future, as any parent would be, the Kellers hoped that Helen might somehow receive an education. And in the late 1800s, this still meant a classical education. Helen Keller began her adapted classical education at the age of 6 with her private teacher, Annie Sullivan. Although no one could predict the eventual outcome, the Keller family embarked on this ambitious but beautiful journey nonetheless, and the world received captivating evidence that truly a classical education can benefit any child. In her later adult years, Helen Keller departed, in some ways, from the philosophies of a classical education, including upholding some truths of Western civilization, but her story remains an important one as we explore how classical education can benefit any child. After all, Helen Keller's education, more than a century ago, mirrors the classical education of today. As soon as language unlocked Helen's young mind at the water pump so many years ago, most of us know nothing about the rest of the story. But after Helen understood language and words and the meaning, then Annie Sullivan taught Helen the same academic content other classically educated children learn, but through patient, untiring finger spelling into Helen's hand. From ages 8 to 10, she studied geography and history. She read of Greek heroes and the classical ancient civilizations. She enjoyed beautiful language through good literature. She read poetic selections from the Old and New Testaments, Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, Dickens, A Child's History of England, Little Women, Heidi, The Swiss Family Robinson, and countless other books which can still be found on the library shelves of any classical school today. Helen treasured her books. I accepted them, she said, as we accept the sunshine and the love of our friends. From the ages of 11 to 13, Helen learned Latin from a Latin scholar. How many people knew that Helen Keller learned Latin? It was just expected. She also learned French in raised print. She studied more advanced histories of Greece, Rome, and the United States as Annie continued to spell lessons into Helen's hand. By age 16, Helen read works in the original Latin and German. And at age 20, she enrolled in Radcliffe, where she read literature in French, studied world history, read poetry critically, and learned advanced English composition. Helen's only real academic failure came when she was 17. One of her teachers made some common errors with this child with special needs, mistakes which continue to be made in many educational settings today. First, the teacher determined that Helen must study and devote herself only those areas in which she was weakest, namely, for her, physics, algebra, and geometry. Rather than focusing on her areas of strength and ability, she needed to have a fully remedial classical education, according to this teacher. Moreover, he taught these subjects in a large classroom without necessary modifications. It's unthinkable for us today, but for example, he wrote visual geometry proofs on the board with no means for Helen to follow along. As a result, Helen required additional instruction with a tutor before she could enter Radcliffe, as previously planned. Looking back over her education, Helen later wrote, "From the storybook Greek heroes To the Iliad, read in Greek, was no day's journey, nor was it altogether pleasant. One could have traveled around the world many times while I trudged my weary way through the labyrinthine mazes of grammars and dictionaries. Helen received a remarkable classical education because her parents and her teachers bonded together to help her, and she persevered. Although her disabilities remained with her all her life, so did her love for literature. When I read, she wrote, when I read the finest passages of the Iliad, I am conscious of a soul sense that lifts me above the narrow, cramping circumstances of my life. My physical limitations are forgotten. My world lies upward. The length and the breadth and the sweep of the heavens are mine. If classical education could give Helen Keller the tools to overcome great obstacles and embrace the sweep of the heavens so many years ago, why do even less severely challenged children with special needs today fail to receive such a bountiful education? Largely, the answer is simply historical timing. At the turn of the century, as special education grew in acceptance in the early 1900s, classical education had begun to wane. In the 1930s, the height of classical study in the United States in sheer numbers, nearly 1 million students studied Latin annually. 1 million students still studied Latin. And as a side note, this included my little grandma, who was smart and capable, but was not college-bound because her family didn't have any money. This was in the Jefferson City area, which many of you know. In the middle of mid-Missouri. She grew up on a hog farm. She had to go to the public school. She was not in the college track. And yet she had 4 years of Latin. She graduated in 1930. I have her report cards because she saved those things. She had an entire course called Virgil, an entire course called Caesar, meaning she was not studying introductory Latin, she was reading works in Latin. It sharpened her mind, it made her letters worth keeping. I've saved all of her letters, her diaries. It all reflected the literature, the literary wonders of her education in the middle of Missouri. Well, by the 1970s, so-called progressive and experimental education dominated. Many of us who are a little older and were educated at that time can attest to this. About the same time, just as classical education had all but disappeared in the 60s and 70s, landmark special education legislation, Public Law 94-142, passed in the United States. This law mandated public education for all handicapped children. Public, yes, and mandated, but often much less effective and far less beautiful. So today, much of regular education has strayed so far from the pursuit of that which is significantly true, good, and beautiful, or as Kevin Clark said earlier, real, that many children with challenges and special needs who have been placed in remedial or even age-based classrooms receive little that is inspiring, excellent, or formative. In the past, even basic education meant purposeful instruction in the 3 arts of language: grammar, logic or dialectic, and rhetoric. A good liberal arts education also involved the 4 arts of mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These 7 liberal arts developed the mind and provided the student with essential tools for learning intrinsic to his education. The student also studied history, literature, art, all for the formation of a strong mind and noble character. And throughout the centuries, catechesis, teaching the faith, has also been urged alongside the liberal arts for matters of the soul. Instead, today, the ideal in special education is individualized instruction in which the child's characteristics, rather than prescribed academic content, provide the basis for teaching. In some special education teacher training programs, not only progressivism and pragmatism dominate, but also a fatalistic, dehumanizing behaviorism dominates in our teacher training programs. The child's mind and soul seem forgotten. The humanity of the child with special needs, the humanity of any child, must determine the education he receives. Some suggest that as many as 1 in 4 children have special educational needs of one form or another. 1 in 4. Each of these children is a human being, created in the image of God. Shall we assign all of these students to a menial, servile education and deny them the riches of a beautiful, humane, liberating education? And worse, shall we base our deterministic placements on early testing with no regard to what the child might be able to overcome with the aid of an excellent teacher? The ancient Roman orator Quintilian wrote this: "There is no foundation for the complaint that only a small minority of human beings have been given the power to understand what is taught them, the majority being so slow-witted that they waste time and labor. On the contrary, you will find the greater number quick to reason and prompt to learn. This is natural to man. Dull and unteachable persons have been very few. The proof of this is that the promise of many accomplishments appears in children, and when it fades with age, this is largely due to the failure not of nature but of care. But some have more talent than others. I agree," he says. "Then some will achieve more, and some less. But we never find one who has not achieved something by his efforts." Regardless of his challenges, any child is called to do more than receive services. He is called to love and serve his neighbors. Even if he is never able to hold a full-time paying job, classical education can help the child with special needs bring purpose, love, and comfort to those around him, including his parents. He is a student with lessons to learn, teachers to respect, and parents to honor. He's a young man who holds the door for aging members of his congregation. She's the person who thoughtfully replenishes a dog's fresh water bowl when her neighbor is away at work. Any child is a son or a daughter, brother or a sister, grandchild or friend with a high calling of gracious and tender service as God works through the child for his loving purposes. We see uniquely converging opportunities at this time in history. Information abounds on special needs, such as autism, and specific learning disabilities, such as dyslexia and dysgraphia. Classical education enjoys a resurgence in numerous and growing pockets for the youngest children through university levels. Abundant resources now offer instruction in Latin, the history of ancient civilization, of mathematical arts and more at every level and with any amount of repetition and practice the child needs. Our own Simply Classical curriculum from Memoria Press gives daily lesson plans for a full year for the child's entire education. Teachers, homeschooling parents, tutors, anyone who seeks to teach any child can find resources for adapting and teaching reading, composition, Greek, music theory, literature, logic, and even rhetoric. Perhaps the child will eventually prove incapable of progressing to advanced levels in one area or in every area. However, if taught slowly, patiently, and systematically, even those children who are identified with or suspected of having special needs can receive a substantial, elevating, and beautiful education. A classical education can address any child's challenges and cultivate in him a lifelong appreciation for lasting truth, beauty, and goodness. Modifications can help with behavioral and neurological difficulties, language, sensory challenges, specific learning disabilities, and even severe mental illness. Martin Cothran read the draft manuscript for Simply Classical years ago. When he did, he said this: "If a child cannot accommodate the amount or depth of knowledge of most children, it is not less, but more important that what he learns be of the highest quality." I'll say that again. If a child cannot accommodate the amount or depth of knowledge of most children, it is not less, but more important that what he learns be of the highest quality. Martin was echoing the words of Thomas Aquinas, written centuries earlier: "The slightest knowledge of the greatest things is greater than the greatest knowledge of the slightest things." A simply classical education brings the greatest things to the lives of children with special needs. You're going to meet 3 children right now whom most would deem unlikely candidates for a classical education, as we now put a face to the framework. We'll call them case studies, child A, B, and C. Together they illustrate with grace and courage the wonders God can work in the lives of his children. Child A, he is male. He has severe auditory processing difficulties, meaning his hearing acuity is just fine, but the words just don't seem to make it intact to his mind. He tests, in fact, at the 1 percentile for all children his age at processing things correctly when spoken. Severe auditory processing disorder, autism, also a bipolar form of schizophrenia, so up and down. In childhood, clinical oppositional defiant disorder, and if you've heard of ODD, there's a lot of defiance, arguing with parents, arguing with teachers, fighting with other children. Attention deficit disorder, the inattentive kind. Poor impulse control, and low average intelligence. This is all child A. So if you were to receive an application at your school from a child who has all of these things, your first thought might not be, well, this would be a good candidate for a classical education. Imagine the sort of education he would be relegated to today. Child B, female, borderline intellectual disability, and that's the new term for mentally handicapped or mental retardation, so on the borderline. autism, many medical conditions, a sleep disorder that impacts learning, severe learning disabilities, and childhood onset schizophrenia, which is one of the most retractable and difficult to treat, including hallucinations, seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there, and having troubles organizing themselves and their thoughts. Now that child's lower intelligence alone would often lead us to believe that she should receive an entirely different education, one focused on the most pragmatic things, tying her shoes, opening a can, learning the basics of making her bed, things like that. But we would certainly not leap to the thought that with a severe language disorder, she might be helped by learning Latin. Instead, imagine what her education would consist of. And child C, female, deaf, blind, nonverbal or minimally verbal, severe behavior problems, needs significant modifications to learn, and all lessons require finger spelling. Consider the education she might be offered today. So we'll take each child one at a time. Child A, in spite of his presentation, from his earliest days, he listened to stories and children's poetry. He heard music like Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf to listen more closely for things like the instruments who were representing animals. He learned Aesop's fables for moral lessons such as honesty. He studied Greek and Latin roots of words to learn language. He heard Bible stories to rebuke and to comfort in truth and in forgiveness. He studied formal Latin for several years. He learned mathematics and astronomy, elements of the quadrivium, the mathematical arts. His classical education required modifications during his most turbulent years of emerging mood disorders, but he read children's literature to cultivate a more compassionate understanding of others. Literature cultivates empathy. He read about heroes and courage. He was told to keep a hero's notebook, a great men notebook throughout his studies, into which he drew pictures of great men and wrote down the characteristics of those men that made them good leaders or good citizens. He learned about honor and duty, leadership and integrity. So when tested at a children's hospital, as such children are often required to do, he evidenced much higher scores in things that children with oppositional defiant disorder normally have trouble with. The examiner noted specifically that while most students with oppositional behaviors test poorly on measures of character, this male student scored high on ratings related to protectiveness and bravery and compassion. This student received more than a moral classical education. He also received a redemptive Christian education, which is important. Raised with the hymns, liturgy, and Holy Scripture of the Christian Church, this student heard the healing words of forgiveness in Christ. A classical education is an education in the liberal arts and the liberal sciences. Theological science is the queen of the sciences. His education began each day with readings from the Holy Scripture. At his father's urging and his mother's homeschooling over 2 years, he committed to memory Ephesians 1:1 to 2:10. This was during middle school years when things were especially tumultuous for him. Ephesians 1:1 to 2:10. Beautiful passages. This portion includes these comforting words. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace. Homeschooled from infancy, when he entered 8th grade, he was tested academically. Now remember all of his diagnoses: auditory processing, autism, schizoaffective disorder, ADD with inattention. Now, due to the low processing, he scored low on any measure requiring speed or fluency. However, the remaining scores revealed the impact of bringing the greatest things to a child with special needs. In academic knowledge, science, and the humanities, he tested as an early 9th grader with score, although he was just going to 8th grade. Phonetic skills, early 9th grader. Math calculations as a late 9th grader. Passage comprehension as an early 10th grader. Story recall as a post-secondary student. And math applied problems as a post-secondary student. This is my son. Adopted at 14 months and given a classical education at home all the way through high school. Today, Michael is 26 years old. He stands at 6'2". Due to years of studying the ancient Romans, the Greeks, and heroes throughout time, Michael loves history. His first job was at a history museum in our local town, which is rich with history. It's on the Mississippi River in Missouri. It's all more about test scores, more than about test scores. It's more about leading the child to serve, whether it's a paid job or not. On Sunday mornings, he serves in our church, lighting the candles before the service. He ushers. He spreads salt when our Missouri walkways get icy. He is the self-appointed greeter. It's a very tiny congregation, but if he fails to greet one of the elderly women in our tiny congregation, she will find him. I have overheard her saying, "You know, Michael, yours is the only hug I receive all week." Child B, autism, childhood onset schizophrenia, borderline intellectual disability. You might expect that this young girl would perform academically at a 2nd or 3rd grade level, and with the intellectual disability, that might be fine. There are a lot of wonderful books written at that level. Courage of Sarah Noble, Little Bear, Boxcar Children come to mind. And indeed, with dysgraphia and math learning disability, some scores when she entered 8th grade reflected those disabilities and the predictions thereof, but others did not. Reading fluency testing as an early 8th grader would score. Reading fluency, the ability to just read with inflection and at a good rate. Phonetic skills as a mid-8th grader. Oral comprehension as a late 10th grader. Academic knowledge, science, and humanities as an early 11th grader. Writing fluency as a mid-11th grader. And oral expression as a mid-12th grader. This child had a significant language disorder from early childhood. So this is not mere scatter, as we sometimes see in special ed, where you have some high scores and some low scores. It's not just that. Because at age 3, she had tested in the lowest 6th percentile for vocabulary, which is a good measure of language all across the board. And that was commensurate with her intelligence. So it was expected that all of the things would be at that level. It was not a surprise. But after years of Latin, literature, poetry, she had begun writing poetry herself. And she now tested, when she entered 5th grade, in the gifted range in vocabulary. Now, who is child B? This is my daughter, Michelle. Please stand. I'll try to save time. She actually has some of her poetry books here, and she would like to read for you in a little bit. Thanks to her classical education filled with children's books and stories, Shakespeare and music, scripture and hymnody, Michelle, who was once confused by language, now loves words. I don't know if you caught it during Kevin Clark's talk earlier when he asked, what was one of my goals with the line that was to be memorized? Michelle raised her hand and she said, Excelsior, ever higher. Now, I don't think he could hear, and he thought that she was asking, does that word in Latin mean ever higher? But what she was saying is one of his goals with teaching, the way that he was teaching, was to have them think in a way that's ever higher. Our homeschool high school was called Excelsior Academy. So today, Michelle appreciates the opera, the ballet, Shakespeare. She loves attending such things. So for birthday presents, Christmas presents, that's what she wants, tickets to those sorts of events. I do not think that that would have happened in any other educational setting. And it's not me, I have to say at the outset, that I tried teaching from the progressive methods that I was taught, and I failed in classrooms in private special needs settings. This was something I wanted to bring to my children. I didn't know if you could do it with children who had special needs, but I thought, if this is the best education for anyone, then why would I not at least try? And we'll just see how far we can get. It was miraculous to me because I have a master's degree in special education. I had worked professionally in several settings. I had often seen high IQ and low achievement, but I had not ever seen low IQ and high achievement, a disparity in that way. In fact, one of the evaluators said, of Michelle in particular, said she seems to be achieving at a level higher than her potential. Which is just so silly, but I guess she didn't know what else to say. Child C. Oh, and so work. Michelle's first job, her skills were not necessarily academic, despite what I said with her test scores. Her greatest, probably intuitive gift became compassion. So her first, which is why she brought me the tissue in the middle. Her first job was volunteering in a nursing home in our little town. She thought she would just volunteer, not ask for pay, so she did that for 3 years. She was exceptionally good with the elderly. She also has always had a very articulate voice that's clear and projects. It was always a little loud for her peers, but it was perfect with the elderly residents who complained that most people mumble, but not Michelle. She could be heard very easily. And she's always been very cheerful, so she would bring cheer. Well, one time, Michelle had an especially difficult medical condition, and I said, is there anything, it's kind of like a bucket list, I don't like that term, but is there anything in your life that you would really want that you don't currently have? And she said, I would really like a job, a paying job. By now, she had graduated. So that conversation prompted her to go into the administrator's office, who always had an open door. And the way that the gal told me later, she's a friend, she said, she not only came into my office, but she closed the door behind herself. And she said, it's been an honor to volunteer here for 3 years, but it would be a greater honor if you would hire me. So indeed, she was hired as to fill a position that did not yet exist. It was the activities aide. So she helped with bingo. She helped with the balloon volleyball, with the residents in their wheelchairs swatting balloons with fly swatters over a little volleyball net that was down on the ground. She helped with all of those things and truly loved it. Then along came COVID, activities stopped, so now she works in a coffee shop in our town that hires people with special needs. She has colleagues, she loves that equally. Child C, you already know, deaf, blind, female, nonverbal. You would never think that you would bring such language and such richness, Latin and Greek, to someone who started her life as a nonverbal person. And severe behavior problems she didn't even want to learn. Child C wrote an autobiography that changed everything for me. It's entitled The Story of My Life. Her book persuaded me, a homeschooling mom of twins with special needs, that not only could I do this with my own children, but that I must do this with my own children. My childhood heroine, was Annie Sullivan, anyway. When I saw what she had sacrificed to give of herself each day, I realized that I must do this also. And Child C, of course, is Helen Keller. Eventually, as we said, Helen learned Latin and Greek. She read works in the original languages. She studied at Radcliffe and inspired millions. She worked hard, and so did Annie Sullivan. She could not study in the same way or with the same amounts as most children, but she studied what was needful to become an educated human being. A classical education does not cure special needs. A classical education gives us an effective way to educate a child in spite of their special needs, his special needs, and to the greatest extent possible for that child. Even when test scores do not soar, the child benefits from the truth and the goodness and the beauty he hears and sees and contemplates each day. In Simply Classical, we write that classical education will not remove the child's challenges. Classical education simply provides a means by which a child can be educated, truly educated, in spite of his challenges. And all of this brings us back to the beginning. If a child cannot accommodate the amount or depth of knowledge of most children, it's not less, but more important that what he learns be of the highest quality. We hear echoes of encouragement in our efforts, hearkening all the way back to ancient Roman orator Quintilian, who also said this: even if we fail, those who make an effort to get to the top will climb higher than those who from the start despair of emerging where they want to be and stop right at the foot of the hill. Mrs. Cheryl Swope, the beloved founder of Memoria Press, encouraged all parents and teachers with these words: a classical education is like climbing a mountain, each child benefiting from whatever vistas he or she attains in that upward journey. Be encouraged. Any educable child can receive these great benefits of classical education: greater self-knowledge, timeless tools for learning, a more disciplined mind, a love of study, and a dedicated life of service. Classical education is adaptable. We can do this within our classical Christian schools. A classical Christian education can become a beautiful gift to your students, so they can say with Helen Keller, "My world lies upward, the length and the breadth and the sweep of the heavens are mine." Thank you.
Okay, here we go. Old name. See young man bowed in bed. Justice came and paid the cost for those he came to save us all. He did what justice demanded, all paid for our release. This man's body broken by sin, broken by judgment, we stand chagrined, to bear upon ourselves yet groaning, to beg for God's tender mercy. The lash he suffered once for all, and to his Father obeyed his call, judgment and exchange for peace. This old man lies stiff and cold, soon to be but dead and old. One day though it shall rise to the skies, in God's banquet hall everlasting life. The last one I'm going to read for you is called Ballad of the Suffering One. Little Beth lies all alone on her bed of hay, prayerful minded, God alone, Jesus for my sake. Thou wilt save me, God most high, from all without within, my darkest and most depressing thoughts, all I ever did. Through the night and morn I weep, Jesus answers care. Daylight shall be gone to grave, Jesus is still there. Though I lie and some may place stone atop my head, Jesus answers yet again, Jesus answers prayer. At your portal, at your door, I am listening. I hear your cry, I hear your plea. With light and airy footsteps tread, gladly follow me. At the throne, before the Lamb, my journey here begun. He looks me up and looks me down, says unto me, shall come. Fellow sufferer, he says, I bid thee welcome home. So here I am, and here I'll stay, within the court of God's own land. At his table he has called me to himself again. He picks me up, he cradles me in his tender arms. He brings me home,